Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, just doing a quick video in my office to address the latest bit of rumor that is actually rather significant that has to do with Xbox and the possibility of Microsoft leaving the console wars altogether. So first, if you guys can do me a favor before we talk about this, because I want to basically do a little history lesson here, address what I think might be going on, how credible this is, all that sort of stuff. If you guys can do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out my social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel, all that stuff, it's in there. I appreciate the support on those platforms, I really do, especially Patreon. So yeah, we're in my office just because it's easier and I can look at some of these quotes directly and we can talk about it. So if you're like, wait, what did you say about Xbox leaving? So here's the rumor as it happened today at the time I'm recording this. Supposedly, Microsoft is planning to go the way of my beloved Sega and abandon the console wars altogether. That is the core rumor. Now, you guys know me, I don't really like to put a whole lot of credibility into rumors in general, and this is a big one. This is big enough that I actually felt like it actually needed to be sat down and discussed, because if I'm honest, I'm not entirely certain it's wrong. Yeah. So, I don't know where this actually originated. It basically seems like what happened is we got a lot of stories lately about Starfield possibly coming over to PlayStation 5, that upcoming Bethesda Indiana Jones game coming over to PS5, etc. And then it just started to spiral, it looks like, to the point where we're like talking about Gears of War and Halo and everything coming to PS5 as well. And this has gotten a lot of traction today. So obviously there could be massive updates, and there, in fact, we know for sure there will be next week addressing this. But eventually what came out and let a lot of fuel, or added a lot of fuel to the fire, was the man himself, Phil Spencer, who runs the Xbox division. He came out and he tweeted after all this, because this must have been big enough that they felt they had to. He says, "We're listening and we hear you. We've been planning a business update event for next week, where we look forward to sharing more details with you about our vision for the future of Xbox. Stay tuned." Now, let me just say this outright. If there was no credibility to this whatsoever, if people working at Xbox saw, like, we're supposedly leaving, they would laugh and be like, lol, this is not real, and they would basically say as much. It would be like if you saw a rumor about Adam to give up YouTube and only exclusively make content for OnlyFans. I would no doubt make a joke about it, but I would, of course, come out and be like, yeah, that's bull. That's obviously not true. He doesn't deny it. Not even remotely. All he really says is kind of one of those safe answers, like, I hear what you guys are talking about, we'll talk about it next week, is effectively the message he's giving. So let's assume for a second there is credibility to this. What do we expect from this update? If I'm honest, this was kind of easy to predict. I've been saying for years, you can go back to videos that are over 10 years old, over a decade old on this channel. Prediction videos before the Xbox One had even come out, where I was basically saying I kind of saw Microsoft eventually doing this in favor of not necessarily third-party support. I didn't really know what you would call it at the time. Now we would think of it more as Game Pass, maybe being available on other platforms. And it was, the writing was always on the wall for how obvious this seemed, especially as they continued to chip away at the Xbox's hardware division, where they cared less and less about exclusive content, where they were like, all right, anything that comes out on Xbox will also be available immediately on PC. You're effectively devaluing your own hardware, and it's only getting worse and worse and worse. This might also, to be fair, have been a condition of the Activision acquisition from multiple governments, for all we know, where they're like, you can't have this many IPs exclusive to one system, you have to spread that around. I don't pretend to know that. But it's also possible that Microsoft's, and we know from the, let's do some history here. Microsoft, the entire reason they got into the Xbox console hardware business at all was back in, they were working with Sega in the late 90s, learning a lot about how video game hardware worked, what that industry was like. And they really didn't like the direction Sony was taking it. Sony was taking it less from games and more into a technical method by which to control the living room. So your PlayStation wouldn't just be your video game system, it would also then be your CD player, and eventually with the PlayStation 2 would then be your entertainment suite, so your DVD player. And back in the day, before like PCs were as standard as they are now, there was even rumors, I remember this, I'm old enough to remember this, where back in the day you would think, oh, the possibility that your PlayStation 2 would actually represent your home entertainment computer. Like that would be like where you would watch stuff on that and download stuff on that and play on that. You wouldn't actually need a PC. As absurd as that sounds now, there was some mentality to it at the time. And so Microsoft more or less got into the Xbox division because they didn't want Sony to, as I think the quote was, take over the living room. So the Xbox couldn't necessarily compete immediately on the video game side of things, but it could be a DVD player, though they shot themselves in the foot with that required DVD dongle thing. They tried to have extra features and things like Media Center, but they never quite got the tech right, at least not for the average person. And ultimately, the original Xbox, even though I love that system, it costs them about negative $4.4 billion to get that system out. In the end, that's how much money they lost on it. Now, the 360 is an interesting story because it should have worked. It actually was a really successful system initially. And it even was the only system they ever made that actually did very well in Japan, at least initially. And then the whole Red Rings of Death fiasco ended up costing them massive amounts of money, causing them a huge hole. So they never really made money on that system, and the Japanese story is depressingly fascinating. For the first few years of the Xbox 360, when they put that system out, they basically said that was one of their priorities, was making sure they could compete in Japan, because that was one of the things that really hurt them with the original Xbox. They felt they could handle North America and they would find another way into Europe and Australia, but Japan they just couldn't figure out. So with the 360, they actually let a Japanese engineer design the shape of the system. Not the internals, but the externals, like that shape, that hourglass, like white figure, if you want to call it. They said it was supposed to be kind of modeled after a woman. That was actually done specifically for the Japanese market. And it was meant to compete over there. So what they did was Microsoft said, you know what you're doing, leave it to Microsoft of Japan to figure out. So there was a lot of anime games and shoot 'em up games and all this other stuff made specifically for the Japanese market, and it worked. Believe it or not, the Sega Saturn fan base, which was huge over there, had migrated to the 360. That was the jump over there. It's very different than for us. And they were doing really well for the first few years. Then eventually, I think it was around 2009, 2010. I don't know if this is around the time Don Matrick came in or not. I'm not totally sure, although we can blame him for a lot of this. But what ended up happening around then is the 360 was brought, a Japanese 360 was brought to North America, to Microsoft of US, to like give a presentation on what is Xbox in Japan like right now. And they showed them that it was just all these like shoot 'em ups and hentai games and also anime games, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I know there's two different things, I get it, but anyway, there was a lot of that stuff too. And so they were like, yeah, this is what Xbox in Japan is like. And Microsoft US or Xbox US was like mortified. They couldn't believe that the Microsoft name was on this stuff they didn't understand. So they shut that down, said you can't do that anymore. And they just started being like, you got to have Call of Duty and Madden. That's what the Japanese want. And then the brand tanked completely. It never recovered. In Japan, it never recovered after that, to the point where you can look into the stats for things like the Xbox One sales in Japan were a joke, like an absolute joke. To be fair to the Series X, it was doing pretty well initially, but that was largely off the back of the fact that the PlayStation 5 had this substantial shortage and, not to get political, renewed ties between the United States and Japan meant there were a lot more Xboxes pumped into U.S. military bases, which effectively counted for sales in Japan. It doesn't really matter. And Game Pass. The Japanese liked Game Pass. But it wasn't enough. So now we look at the North American side of things and the European side of things, and this really all comes down to that Don Matrick announcement of the Xbox One, the TV sports and DRM Online, Connect, all that stuff that I'm sure you guys remember. We don't need to talk too much about it. But you can really go back and look and say that was the moment. That was the moment there was no recovery. Like, had it not literally been Microsoft, any other company would have absolutely collapsed out of the video game industry at that point. The amount of money they hemorrhaged from that. So they spent the entire generation just having Phil Spencer figure out how to kind of salvage it. And he pretty much undid everything he could from the Don Matrick era, you know, getting rid of the DRM stuff immediately before the system even launched, disconnecting the Kinect, although they kept it bundled for a while before eventually removing it, making it less integrated with the whole TV sports thing, eventually redesigning it into the Xbox One S, trying to make it seem more like an actual video game system. And then, of course, the Series X and Series S. But anyway, the point is, through all that, it was obvious they were caring less and less and less about the hardware and more about the software side of things. So what did they do over that time? They started just buying up studios. You know, the most obvious recent examples would be Activision, because that was the game we all kind of watched them play over the last year or so. But, you know, there was Bethesda, and there's things that go all the way back to, like, Rare. I mean, there's a whole long list of studios that Microsoft absorbed. So my point is, while I kind of sort of believe this, like, I believe it or not, I actually do, I think there's a high probability that they are going to effectively say, not that your Xbox is going to become junk tomorrow, but like, we don't really care about supporting it that much anymore. You know, like, there's still going to be games. We're probably going to finish out the generation. Your online content will still work indefinitely, whatever, but we're probably not going to make a successor system. And we'll probably start integrating more deeply with Sony and Nintendo to whatever extent you can, and especially on PCs, just to have that Xbox experience. And more or less, they will transform, this is my guess, into an IP powerhouse. I think that in a weird way, even though their initial goal kind of failed of the whole take over the living room, in a sense, they kind of took over the video game industry because they've really absorbed like every IP out there. But you might be wondering, like, why? I thought Xbox was so successful. Why was that the case? Do you remember what I said about the net negative $4.4 billion on the original Xbox? That system never made money. The 360 never made money. They spent it all on the Red Rings of Death fiasco. The Xbox One, a system that completely flopped in a like major market and really didn't do well out in the other markets eventually. And the Game Pass concept, which actually costs them a substantial amount just on the way Game Pass works, where you have to pay a guaranteed amount to the developer with no understanding or guarantee that Microsoft itself will make back that cash. The point is, the Xbox brand has always kind of functioned more as a jobs program and has really never made any money. So with that being understood, maybe they've just reached that point where even Microsoft, the second most valuable company in the world, if not the most valuable, I think it's like Apple and Microsoft, so they've reached that point where they're like, do we want to keep hemorrhaging money on this forever? It's been 23 years. And they don't make a profit on it. So why continue to do it? Like I said, it was a jobs program for a very, very long time. But, yeah, I don't know, man. Like, obviously this could all end up being nothing. But I've always kind of seen this one coming. Like, the idea that they were going to do this third-party stuff. And when I say third-party, like I said, they own all this stuff. They didn't just buy Activision for nothing, for no reason. I think the idea was, you know, get rid of the hardware side of things and kind of go the route of Sega to an extent, which is just, you know, use our IPs. We'll continue to make game content. We'll support it on other platforms. And we'll just kind of farm out the IPs and we'll just make money off that rather than having to deal with a hardware division, which they have very seriously been less and less and less and less interested over time. I mean, you have to remember, Microsoft is ultimately a software company more than it is a hardware company. Like, outside of Xbox stuff, I mean, I'd have to go back to like the Zune to start thinking. I mean, obviously they've made other things. Like, they have a tablet thing that they made. They don't make that much hardware, I guess is kind of my point. So I can see why that kind of makes sense. But I don't know, man. Like, personally, how do I feel? Let's assume for a second this is true. And the scenario is just, hey, we're going to keep supporting the system for a little while. We're just not making any more after this. Your games are going to stay online for, you know, a number of years or whatever all that stuff is. And we're going to continue to pump out content on, you know, PC and whatever Nintendo and Sony put out, etc. We're fine with that. Assuming that's the case, I mean, it probably won't feel any different for quite some time, but eventually it'll start to get weird. There's going to be more and more games that don't function and all that. I mean, that's not like the worst thing ever, but at the same time, I also say this from a perspective of a 37-year-old man who, you know, has seen this through all the way through its lifetime. You know, I'm kind of sitting there thinking about that. What's that meme with, what's this? Not Seth Rogen. James Franco, where he's got like a rope around his neck and he goes, first time. Like, I'm sitting there, like, I'm thinking of all these kids who are like, oh my God, a world without Xbox. How could that be? I'm like, I remember when this happened to Sega. I remember when this happened to a whole bunch of companies that would just show up and leave. I'm not going to say this for certain. I would have to actually crunch the numbers, but it is possible that this span, if you argue that Sega effectively left the hardware in 2001, then essentially we've had 23 years of stability from 3 consistent companies, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, with no other real attempts of competition. You had a couple little mini attempts. I would argue, honestly, the last real one that wasn't Sega was the VM Labs and their new one, and that was 2000. Now, people will point out, like, what about the Ouya? It's like, that was never a real thing. Even if it, you know, the VM Labs new one attempted to be a real thing and failed spectacularly. Ouya, even if it had been successful, would never have been a real threat to anything. Or the Mattel Hyperscan. Like, it's the same department. Like, nobody was going to choose the Mattel Hyperscan over, like, the Xbox 360. It was never a legitimate threat. Anyway, that's not my point. This is just a significant day in gaming history, assuming it's actually true. And yeah, I mean, personally, you know, I'll get on. You know, like, again, at my age, I just feel bad for, like, younger generation that aren't used to this kind of thing. And then you do have to wonder what the fallout of this is, which they also own Fallout, don't they? You know, I am one that is pro competition, because effectively, if Sony is the only one making, like, a legitimate console, like, Nintendo will always be off in a corner doing their own thing. Then you've given Sony complete control of an ecosystem where effectively it's a monopoly. Now, granted, people will be like, oh, there's PCs and stuff. That is absolutely true. But, you know, part of the reason gaming on PC is as cheap as it is because it has to deal with console competition. The less competition you have, the less incentive anybody has to give you good deals on anything. You know, it's like if you want to buy a used car and you live in a town where there's only one car lot or something like that, the guy has no reason to ever cut you a deal. But if there's 2 used car lots, they have to compete with each other, so you get a better deal. It's just basic economics. So we'll see. This could all be to do about nothing, or this could be one of the darkest days in gaming history. And to be fair, before everybody's like, oh, you're an Xbot. No, it's nothing like that. I would say the exact same thing if Sony was bailing on the PlayStation brand. I would say the exact same thing if Nintendo was. I just don't like the delusion, the disillusion of the gaming industry in its traditional sense. So I don't know. We'll see what happens with this. You know, I know this is just kind of an off the cuff type of video, but it's just how I'm feeling. It's just kind of like, this is strange, assuming it's true. But yeah, I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on this? How do you feel about it? Are you know, do you care? Do you not care? You should care. Even if you were like, I never owned Xbox hardware in my entire life. I'm pure PlayStation, or I'm pure PC, or I'm pure Nintendo, whatever it is. You should still care. Like, in a sense, it'll be good for you because there will be games coming to your platform that get you on that one. But at the same time, less competition never helps. It never helps you as a customer. It might help your favorite piece of plastic, but that's about it. It doesn't necessarily help you. So anyway, yeah, what are you guys' thoughts? Let me know. If you guys would also do me a favor, like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, as well as check out all my social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, Spreadshirt, Travel Channel. Yeah, I think that's the whole thing. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.